She thought about running away. She thought about it when his fist left her breathless. When his words cut like a blade. When his family made her feel like a stranger in her own home. Grace realized the house she built had slowly become a cage she had to survive. She never ran. And that alone tells you everything about the woman she was. He married a gentle girl who believed in forever. Then he taught her how to dream of escape. But what Grace did not know was this. Some prisons have no walls. Some chains cannot be seen. She believed the husband would save her, not knowing she was walking into a storm that would never end. And the worst part, the story was only just beginning. Before the marriage, she was just a girl, fresh out of the College of Education, where she studied health education and had completed her national diploma. She was waiting patiently for her call-up letter for youth service, unsure of what the future held. On most free days, she helped out at her mother's shop, a small patent medicine store that served the neighborhood. It was there, among shelves of bottles and folded curtains, that her quiet life passed by. Then one afternoon, a message came for her to return home immediately. She didn't know why, but something felt different. When she arrived, she walked into the living room and froze. Her parents were seated side by side, their faces unusually serious. With them sat two strangers, an elderly woman with sharp assessing eyes, and a younger man who avoided her gaze. In that moment, she sensed that her life was about to change forever. When her father noticed the pause in her steps, he smiled and motioned her closer. "Come and sit," he said gently. When she settled beside them, her father cleared his throat, as men do when important words are about to be spoken. "This," he said, resting his hand lightly on her shoulder, "is my only child, Grace." Grace bowed her head slightly, as custom demanded, and greeted the two strangers with respect. Once the introductions were made, the connection became clear. The woman was a sister to her father's friend, and the young man was her only son, a successful businessman. They didn't say much to her, before asking her to get back to the shop. As she walked back to her mother's store, her mind was spinning with questions. Among those thoughts was a hint of something more. Only a few days ago, she had prayed for a life partner. Now, she couldn't help but wonder if this was it. The next afternoon, he visited her at her mother's store. He was dressed casually in blue button-down shirt and black jean trousers. His expression was the complete opposite of the day before. There was a sense of familiarity now. She welcomed him in and offered him a bottle of cold water. They spent the rest of the afternoon getting to know each other, and he even made her laugh a few times. But when it was time to leave, his face turned serious. The words he said next left her heart racing. "I want to marry you," he said. "I would like you to think about it and give me your answer the next time I visit." She stood frozen for a few seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice was so faint she could barely hear it herself. 3 months passed before she heard from him again. During that time, she prayed like never before, and the church became her second home. Every minute was spent weighing his audacious proposal, wondering if this was truly God's will or the answer she had asked for. Then, her father suffered a stroke, an event that left her in a position of immense pressure, forced to carry the burden of her family while waiting for a man who might never return. Just as she felt she could no longer carry the weight alone, he returned. He didn't come empty-handed, he arrived bearing gifts for the family. He apologized deeply for his long absence, explaining that his business had faced major challenges that required his full attention. Over the next few weeks, he visited almost every day, quickly becoming a source of strength in their lives. He was resourceful and always knew what to do. On 2 occasions, he even volunteered to drive her father to the hospital for his checkups, taking a burden off her shoulders that she hadn't realized was so heavy. One evening, After returning from a long day at the hospital, they sat together in the quiet of the living room. The house felt different with him there, lighter and more hopeful. He looked at her, and though he didn't say it, she knew he was waiting for the answer he had asked few months ago. She took a deep breath, looking at the man who had not only promised her a future but had stayed to help her through her darkest weeks. The doubt that had clouded her mind for 3 months was finally gone. "I've thought about it," she said, her voice steady this time. "And my answer is yes. I will marry you." A slow, genuine smile broke across his face, the most familiar expression she had seen yet. He reached out and took her hand, and in that moment, she felt a sense of peace. The prayer she had whispered in secret was finally standing right in front of her. Like a miracle, the news of the wedding seemed to have a healing effect on her father. His strength returned day by day until he was finally able to walk without anyone's assistance, using only a simple walking stick for balance. Her mother was transformed as well. The heavy cloud of worry that had hung over her for months finally lifted, replaced by a radiant energy as she began planning the ceremony. She moved through the house with a song on her lips, her hands busy with fabrics and guest lists, looking years younger than she had during the long days of her husband's illness. For the first time in a long while, the house was no longer a place of survival, it was a place of preparation. Amidst the rush of wedding preparations and the excitement of the coming day, there were signs. They were small, simple things, the kind that are easy to ignore when you are full of hope. During this time, she finally met her 2 sisters-in-law, Mary and Christiana. Both were older than her and unmarried. Christiana was older than her husband, while Mary was a few years younger than him. Their behavior was cordial, but cold. They were never rude, yet they were never truly friendly. They spoke to her only when it was strictly necessary, and their words were very short. It left her feeling lonely, even though she had hoped they would be like sisters to her. Then, the night before the wedding, the first real shadow fell. Her mother-in-law suddenly refused to wear the beautiful dress made specifically for the ceremony. She claimed that something had entered her eyes, and it was so painful she could barely see or focus. Because of this, she put away the new clothes and insisted on wearing something much older. "There is no point in wearing something new when I can barely see myself in it," Mama said. It felt like she was quietly showing that she was not happy about the wedding. The wedding finally came and went, but the real shock came when the celebration ended. To her great surprise, she discovered that her husband lived with his mother and his 2 sisters in their family house. She had expected to start her new life in a home of their own, and the arrangement left her feeling uneasy. She decided to bring up her concerns with him, but he simply replied, "This house is convenient for me because it's closer to my business." She didn't want to start an argument so early in their marriage, so she let it slide. But as she began to unpack, she couldn't help but feel that her new beginning was already feeling very crowded. Even though there was no honeymoon for Grace and her husband, David, he tried his best to make up for it. Every weekend, he took her out to shopping malls and restaurants. He was generous and made sure she had everything she wanted. This kindness from David touched her heart deeply. For the first time, Grace felt like she truly belonged to him, and, at that point, she knew she was in love. Grace's happiness was not complete. Aside from those weekend outings, her weekdays were filled with chores that never seemed to end. She spent most of the day either cooking or washing. She did not get any help from her 2 sisters-in-law, Mary and Christiana. Every morning, she was greeted with instructions on what to prepare for the day and other chores that needed doing. At first, she didn't mind the work. But as the days went by, it felt as though she was a maid and not a wife. This realization became very clear when her friend Jane came to visit her new home. Jane found her in the kitchen, looking exhausted and worn out. "Grace," Jane said, looking at her in shock. "Are you telling me that this is how you have been living since you got married?" Grace stood there in silence, unable to find the words to defend her new life. Before she could speak, Mary and Christiana walked into the kitchen. They didn't even acknowledge that Jane was there. "Grace, is the food not ready yet?" Mary asked, checking the pots. "Mama is hungry." They turned and walked out as quickly as they came in. Jane stood there in disbelief. "Grace, you are a wife, not a servant. Does David know they treat you like this?" Grace sighed and looked away. "I haven't told him yet," she admitted. "I don't want to bring up issues this early in our marriage. I just want peace." Jane shook her head firmly. "It doesn't matter if it's early or late, Grace. You should not start what you cannot finish. If you let them treat you like this now, they will never stop." Grace felt the weight of Jane's words, but she wasn't ready to face the truth. Desperate to change the subject, she forced a smile and leaned closer to her friend. "Let's not talk about me anymore," Grace said quickly. "Tell me the latest news in your life. How is your boyfriend? Is everything still going well with you two?" Jane knew what Grace was doing, but she decided to let it go for now. She began to gist about her relationship, but as she talked, Grace's mind kept drifting back to the cold words of her sisters-in-law. Even though she was smiling, the peace she wanted felt further away than ever. A week later, on a hot afternoon, Grace finally reached her breaking point. She had been stuck in the kitchen since morning, preparing what seemed to be the third meal of the day. Her mother-in-law was being very difficult that day. Earlier, Christiana had given Grace the usual instructions to prepare rice for breakfast, claiming it was what Mama wanted. Even though Grace found it strange, she went ahead and prepared the food. Little did she know that she would receive the worst scolding of her life. Mama looked at the plate and shouted, "You have stayed in this house for 4 months and you still do not know what I ate for breakfast. Is this how you took care of your parents at home?" Grace stood there in shock as Mama pointed at the door. "Will you take this out of my sight?" At that moment, Grace realized that her sister-in-law had lied to her, but she didn't know if she had done it on purpose. She felt confused, wondering why Christiana would give her the wrong information. Grace went back to the kitchen to prepare the usual breakfast for Mama, which was tea with fried eggs and bread. By the time she was done, Mama informed her that it had been a long time since she had eaten pounded yam with white soup cooked with fresh catfish. This meant that Grace had to go to the market, buy everything, and then begin the long process of preparing the meal from scratch. By the time she was finally finished, she was so tired that she did not know when she started crying. The tears just began to flow. It was at that moment that David, her husband, walked in. He stood there, surprised to find his wife in the kitchen, looking exhausted and in tears. "Grace?" David asked, stepping toward her. "What is the matter? Why are you crying?" Grace just couldn't bring herself to tell him all that had been going on. She felt too tired, and her heart was heavy with the realization that this was not the marriage she had dreamed of. David did not want to press her further. He gently asked her to wipe her eyes and freshen up, saying he had somewhere to take her. At the thought of leaving the house, Grace felt a spark of relief. She quickly went to get dressed. She didn't know where they were going, but any destination away from that house felt like a blessing. David took her to an apartment not too far from the family house. It was a 3-bedroom flat with a spacious living room and modern finishing. Before she could ask any questions, David turned to her. He told her that this would be their new home and that she would be sleeping there tonight. At his words, she burst into tears again, but this time, they were tears of relief. David pulled her close and apologized for putting her through so much stress. "I did not know things would turn out this way," he said softly. "I will try and make it up to you from now on." Grace looked around the quiet, empty kitchen of her new home. For the first time in 4 months, she felt like she could finally breathe. When they got home, David told his mother and sisters the news. Mama did not take it well. She was angry that David did not tell her about his plans. "Oh, because you are married now, you feel you are too big to tell your mother about your plans," Mama said. David looked at her calmly. "I am a grown man," he replied. "I don't think I need to seek permission from anyone about where I choose to live with my wife." "David," Christiana said, "you know we do not have help around here. How would we manage with her gone?" "You should have informed us earlier so that we could look for help," Mary added. In all of this, Grace kept quiet. She saw now that to them, she was never a daughter-in-law, she was just someone to do the work. David didn't want to hear anymore. He turned to his wife and commanded her to go inside and pack her things. Grace didn't hesitate. She walked past her sisters-in-law without a word, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders with every step she took toward the bedroom. 8 months later, life looked completely different for Grace. She was now heavily pregnant, and things seemed to align perfectly in her new home. David had even bought her a car to make her movements easier and to ensure she was comfortable. Because of her condition and the peace she found in her own space, she visited the family house less often. She was finally enjoying the life she had once dreamed of. One hot afternoon, while she was going about her daily activity in her home, she suddenly froze. A deep, sharp contraction rippled through her body, causing her to lean against the kitchen counter for support. It was stronger than anything she had felt before. She checked the time, trying to stay calm, but a few minutes later, another wave of pain hit her. Her due date was close, and it became clear that the baby was ready to arrive. With her hands trembling slightly, she reached for her phone to call David. 5 hours later, her daughter, Ifunanya, was born. David could not contain his joy. He was smiling from ear to ear, calling all his friends to tell them he was now a father. His joy knew no bounds. The next day, Grace's mother arrived for omogo. She came with pepper soup and yam, the special delicacy for women who had just given birth. From the moment Grace returned from the hospital, her mother took charge, insisting Grace only rest. By the time Ifunanya was now 6 months old, the peace Grace once felt in her new home was drying up, and this time, David was the problem. He had started coming home very late and no longer helped with the baby. A few days ago, a neighbor had called Grace aside to whisper in her ear. She told Grace that David was always at a local joint nearby, and he was not drinking alone. He was always with the same young girl. Grace's heart sank, but she said nothing. Then one night, everything scattered. It was after 11 o'clock and Ifunanya had been crying since evening. Her gums were swollen because new teeth were coming. Grace had carried her, rocked her, sang to her, nothing worked. Her back was paining her. Her body was tired. Then David opened the door and entered. The smell of beer followed him inside. Grace could not hold it anymore. "Why are you just coming now?" she asked him. Her voice was shaking. David stopped. His face changed. He was angry that she dared to ask him such a question. "What kind of nonsense question is that?" he said. "Are you now monitoring me in my own house?" Grace put the crying baby on the bed. She faced him. "So it is true," she said. "You think nobody is seeing you? You have been going to that drinking place with that girl." Her voice rose. "That girl is more important to you than your sick child. She is more important than your fuck." The slap was loud. It sounded like a heavy book hitting the floor. Everything went quiet. The only thing you could hear was Ifunanya, who started screaming even louder on the bed. Grace stumbled back, her hand flying to her hot, stinging cheek. She did not cry. She just stood there, staring at David. "David, you hit me," she whispered. David did not look sorry. Instead, his eyes were full of a strange anger. "If you talk again, I will do it again," he shouted. "Who are you to ask me questions? Because I moved you to this house, you now think you are my mate. You think you can talk to me anyhow because of that neighbor's gossip." Grace looked at him and realized that the man she loved was gone. The person standing in front of her was someone she did not know at all. Before she could even find her voice, David went to the wardrobe. He grabbed her bag and threw it at her feet. "Since you've appointed yourself the watchman of this house, why don't you go and keep watch over your father's compound?" he barked. He grabbed her by the arm and started dragging her toward the front door. Grace started pleading as he dragged her across the floor. "David, please. Don't do this. If not for me, think about your child." David didn't even look at her. "Oh, you did not think about her before running your mouth, right?" he barked. He dragged her out, shoved her into the cold night, and slammed the door in her face. Grace stood there in the dark. She was humiliated, but she did not want to draw attention to herself by knocking and begging. Instead, she picked up her bag and the crying baby and walked to the family house. When she knocked, Mama was surprisingly still awake. But she was not allowed to enter. "So you think you can talk to my son anyhow and expect me to take you in and clap for you? He already called me to tell me what you did." "Mama, please, the baby is sick," Grace begged. "Go back to that neighbor who filled your ears with gossip," Mama said coldly and pushed the door shut. Grace stood there, frozen. She could not believe what was happening. "This must be a dream," she whispered. She couldn't understand how a grandmother could turn her back on a sick grandchild just to prove a point. Crying and shivering, she remembered a distant relative of her mother who lived nearby. She trekked there, her legs heavy. The woman took one look at them and rushed them inside. She was horrified. She immediately prepared some local remedies for Ifunanya's fever. Slowly, the baby's temperature came down, and she finally fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, the woman insisted on taking Grace back. When they arrived at the family house, they found David, his mother, and his sisters all sitting in the parlor as if they were waiting for a trial. The woman did not waste time. "David, I am really disappointed in you," she began. "How can you let your 6-month-old baby sleep outside because of a small quarrel? What kind of a father are you?" She turned to the mother-in-law. "And you, Teresa, how can you turn your back on your own grandchild?" David looked down at his feet, looking very remorseful. "I am sorry," he muttered. "It was the alcohol. I was not in my right mind. It will not happen again." Grace, wanting peace for the sake of her child, also apologized for accusing him of infidelity. They settled the matter and went back to their home. Things seemed to go smoothly for a while. 2 months later, Grace found out she was pregnant again. Handling a toddler while pregnant was becoming too much for her body to bear. She pleaded with David to get her a nanny to help with the chores, and this time, he agreed. Life was finally quiet until one Sunday morning. After they returned from church, Grace's phone rang. It was her father. When she picked up, she heard him crying. "Grace!" He gasped through tears. "Your mother, she slept last night and did not wake up." Grace let out a piercing scream that shook the house. The phone dropped from her hand. Her mother, her only true support, the woman who had stayed with her for Omogwo and loved her unconditionally, was gone. The burial of Grace's mother was a heavy cloud that refused to lift. 6 months after that painful goodbye, Grace found herself back in the hospital labor ward. She gave birth to another beautiful baby girl, whom she named Amanda. But instead of joy, a cold silence came from David's family. When the news reached the family house that it was a girl again, Mama did not hide her anger. She refused to visit the hospital. Christiana and Mary followed her lead, staying away as if Grace had committed a crime. Only David came to see her, accompanied by her friend Jane. Grace sat on the hospital bed, her heart heavy. The grief of losing her mother was still fresh, and seeing her mother-in-law's rejection of the new baby broke her even more. If her mother were alive, the room would have been filled with the smell of pepper soup and the sound of songs. Now, there was only a lonely silence. By the time Amanda was 1 year and 6 months and Ifunanya was 3 years old, Grace realized she was pregnant again. This third pregnancy felt different. It felt like a heavy weight on her shoulders because she knew so much was at stake. Her marriage, her safety, and her peace depended on what was in her womb. David's attitude also took a dark turn. The remorse he showed months ago had vanished. He began to hit her at the slightest provocation. Grace often thought about running away, but when she looked at her 2 little girls, her heart would sink. She had no money of her own, and knew that if she left, David would quickly bring in that girl from the local joint, the one his mother was already encouraging to visit the family house. Grace felt trapped. She couldn't go to her father either. Since her mother's burial, the old man had withered away. He couldn't walk on his own anymore, and he spent his days seated in a chair while his nephew attended to his needs. Grace did not want to be the one to tell him that the big man he married his daughter to was now using her as a punching bag. During her hospital visits, Grace told the doctor she did not want to know the gender of the baby. Whenever the nurse started the ultrasound, Grace would close her eyes tight or look at the ceiling. "I don't want to know," she would say. She was afraid that if she heard it was another girl, she would lose the will to keep going. Instead, she spent her days and nights in prayer. She prayed like she had never prayed in her life. She was a woman standing in the middle of a fire, hoping that this pregnancy would finally be the rain that put the flames out. Then the day arrived. The labor was long and difficult, but when the cry finally rang out, the atmosphere in the room shifted. "It's a boy," the nurse announced. Grace fell back against the pillows, tears of pure relief streaming down her face. "They named him Kenechukwu, thank God." The news traveled like wildfire. The same family members who had turned their backs on Grace suddenly found their way back to her doorstep. Mama was the first to arrive, and this time, she came with joy so loud the whole street knew a king had been born. She immediately began planning an extravagant Thanksgiving and a child dedication that would be the talk of the town. David changed almost overnight. It was as if a heavy veil had been lifted from his eyes. He started coming home early from the shop, no longer smelling of beer, but eager to spend time with Kenechukwu and the girls. He began to treat Grace with a kindness she hadn't seen in years. On several occasions, he surprised her with expensive lace and high-end clothes he bought from a boutique. But the highlight of it all was the morning he led her out to the driveway. Parked there was a brand new SUV. "For the mother of my son," he said, handing her the keys with a wide smile. Things seemed to fall into place. The beatings had become a distant memory, and Grace began to feel that staying in the marriage was finally paying off. However, that feeling did not last long. Death struck again. This time, it was her father. The news broke her completely. She was now an orphan, with no mother to run to and no father to call her daughter. The grief was heavy, and for weeks, Grace moved through her days with pain in her chest. 2 months after the burial, Kenechukwu started pre-nursery. With all 3 children in school during the day, the silence in the house became too loud. Grace was tired of being just a housewife. She needed to breathe, to walk, to feel like herself again. The memory of her parents' death was driving her insane, and she felt her mind slipping away in the loneliness of the four walls. One night, after dinner, she said to David, "I want to start doing something. The kids are in school now. I want to work or start a business." David looked surprised, then his face hardened. "There is no need for that," he said immediately. "I provide everything. What are you looking for?" Grace doubled down. "I am losing my mind staying at home. The grief is too much. I need to be busy." "If you are lonely and need a place to go, Mama is at the family house. Go and keep her company," he replied coldly. "Or are you trying to put yourself out there so other men can start toasting you?" The accusation cut her deep. In her defense, the pain of the last few years boiled over. "I am not like you, David. I don't follow everything in a skirt." Thwack! The sound of the slap was instant. But this time, Grace did not stumble back in silence. The weight of her mother's death, her father's passing, and years of silent suffering fell on her all at once. She was ready to die that day. She started shouting, recounting all his dirty affairs. David flew into a rage. What started as an argument exploded into something far more dangerous. Neighbors began to bang on the door, threatening to break it down. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. David stood there, breathing hard, and without a word of remorse, he grabbed his keys, walked out, and slammed the door behind him. After that incident, David stopped sleeping at home. He moved back to his mother's house, and only showed up on weekends to see the children. He did not say a word to Grace. He acted as if she was a ghost. He would just drop money for the week on the table and leave again. This went on for months. Grace was living like a widow while her husband was still alive. She had no mother or father to report him to anymore. She was alone with her 3 children, wondering how her life had turned out this way. She had the son he wanted, she had the new car, and she had the fine clothes, but she did not have a husband. The children started asking questions. "Mommy, why is Daddy not sleeping here? When is Daddy coming back?" Grace had no answer to give them. She just stood by the window every Sunday evening, watching him drive away. She realized then that even after giving him a son, his mother's house was still more important to him than the home they built together. After 4 months of living at the family house, David decided to move back home. Grace received him with open arms. She made every effort to put the past behind her and be a good wife. She stopped asking to work and made peace with being a housewife. She became very careful with her words, making sure she never said anything that could lead to an argument. For a while, things moved in harmony and peace finally returned to the house. Then one day, Grace noticed that David was limping. He had a small injury on his big toe. Grace's heart sank. She knew David was diabetic. She knew that for him, a small wound was a dangerous thing that could refuse to heal. "David, please let us go to the hospital," she pleaded. But David brushed her off. "I am fine," he snapped. "It is not serious. Don't start your trouble again." Because she did not want to start another fight, Grace let it slide. But as the days went by, the limp became worse. The wound turned dark, and a decaying odor began to come from his foot. The smell filled the room. Grace could no longer keep quiet. Hoping for help, she went to the family house to talk to Mama. She thought Mama would be the one to convince David to seek medical help. But what Mama said left Grace in total shock. "So you want my only son to die in the hospital?" Mama shouted. "Don't you know that his condition was done by his enemies? It must be treated the traditional way." Before Grace could even respond, Mama stepped closer, her eyes full of hatred. "I knew it. I knew you were cursed," Mama screamed. "Since you came into this family, the spirit of death has not left your side. How else can you explain losing both your parents within such a short time? You are a witch. Will you get out of this house now before I pour hot water on you?" she added. Grace rushed outside, her heart pounding. Her ears still carried the insult. David's leg was rotting away at home, and his family was convinced it was a spiritual attack that had nothing to do with his health. She got home to find David sitting in the parlor. The smell of the wound was now filling the entire room. He looked pale and weak, but he still refused to listen to her. He was waiting for his mother. A few hours later, Mama arrived with a local herbalist. He knelt beside David's foot without introduction, examining the blackened foot with eyes that revealed nothing. Then, from his bag, he drew out a bundle of fresh leaves. The man chewed the leaves slowly, his mouth stained green, before spitting the pulp onto David's decaying foot. He did this repeatedly until the entire foot was buried under the wet, chewed leaves. Grace stood in the corner, watching in silence. She didn't say a word. The next day, she called David's sister, Christiana. Since Christiana was a trained nurse, Grace hoped she would talk sense into him. But Christiana gave the same response as their mother. "If David goes to the hospital and they use modern medicine, he will die," Christiana said firmly. "This is not a hospital case." Her heart broke, but she refused to give up. She called David's cousin, Elizabeth, who was also a nurse. Elizabeth came that evening. She took one look at the leg and turned to David. "This is diabetic foot ulcer," Elizabeth warned. "You know you are diabetic. You must go to the hospital now before it leads to sepsis." David looked at her weakly. "I will try the traditional way my mother brought first. If it doesn't work, we will go to the hospital." Elizabeth saw the stubbornness in his eyes and knew she couldn't convince him. She picked up her bag and left. After that, Grace gave up trying. She realized the influence his mother had over him was stronger than his own will to live. She continued with the herbal treatments. Every day, David asked if things were getting better. Grace would tell him they were, but it was a lie. In her heart, she knew his foot was already gone. 3 weeks later, the horror peaked. An exposed artery in David's foot tore open. Within minutes, the parlor floor was flooded with blood. Grace screamed and called the family. They rushed over, but instead of taking him to the hospital, Christiana began to pray. "This blood, stop in the name of Jesus," she shouted, waving her hands over the wound. Mama joined in prayers too. David clutched his chest, gasping for air and complaining about his heart. Then, he went limp. He had given up the ghost. Grace let out a piercing scream that echoed through the house. "They have killed him," Mama wailed. "They have finally killed my only son." As the reality of David's death sank in, Grace felt a burning rage she could no longer hold back. She looked at Mama and Christiana, her eyes flashing with a fire they had never seen. "You have killed him," she screamed, her voice shaking the room. "Mama, you allowed your only son to die like an animal without taking him to the hospital." The family stayed silent for a moment, shocked by her outburst, but Grace didn't care. "Oh, my God, how will I take care of these children now alone?" she said, crying bitterly. David was buried a month later. Despite the bitterness of his family, Grace stayed focused. She decided to be strong for her children. They were the only reason she had left to keep going. After she was done with the mourning period, Grace took a bold step. She refused to let David's hard work go to waste and decided to continue her husband's business. She handled the shop with a strength that surprised everyone. A year later, Mama died of heartbreak, unable to live without her only son. Christiana and Mary eventually moved on and got married. As Grace sat on her living room one evening, she realized her life had taken a path she never imagined. The marriage and life she had dreamed of, the one where she was protected and cherished, had turned into a story of grief, struggle, and early graves. She was an orphan and a widow, left to carry the weight of a family alone. It wasn't the life she wanted, but she was still standing. She learned that a woman's strength is not measured by the life she wanted, but by her ability to carry the one she was given.